Hey guys, it's Matt Gurney with Jen Gerson. The latest episode of the Line podcast starts right now. It is May the 3rd, 2024. Student protests all over North America. I went to one of them this week. We'll talk about that. Pierre Poilievre has a wacko week, but he writes an interesting op-ed. So we're going to talk a bit about that. Magical NATO targets, a foreign interference report that has finally come out, and lots more on the latest episode of the Line podcast. Hey everybody, great to be here with Jen, of course. We got lots to talk about today, including in a couple of minutes how I like to feel old. But first, Jen, we have already announced, we're very excited to have announced, coming up in Edmonton just over a month from now, the Line Ahead event. We've got a great panel. We got Chris Reagan, we've got Trevor Toome, we've got Lisa Raitt joining us in Edmonton for a discussion about future-proofing Canada against some of those threats out there. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to have to fly there, but I guess you're just going to drive up and party with our friends in Edmonton.
Absolutely. We've got the Airbnb booked, man. We're going to make a wreck of ourselves. It's going to be amazing. So the title of the panel is Canada prepared for the next beep storm? It's going to look at not only future-proofing Canada for the inevitable darkness that our terrible timeline entails, but we're going to look at our Canadians' economic situation and just how much bread we have left in the emergency pantry, and then try to imagine, how well could we survive, for example, a major trade dispute with America? How well are we going to survive a major pandemic or continued war in Europe, that sort of thing. So we're going to try and future cast a little bit and also look at see how strong Canada's economy actually is. Actually, kind of a fun anecdote about that we can get into later. But if you have any interest in coming to this event in Edmonton, it's about $40 a ticket. But with that, you're also getting drinks. You're getting food. We're catering. We're going to make this a classy event. And also it's going to be a riot because Matt and I will be there. It's going to be very fun. It's going to be very upbeat. If you're interested, we're going to put the link to that in our description box. It's we're selling those tickets on Eventbrite. You should buy a ticket if you want to, because I would tell you we are almost a third sold out for the tickets already, and the event's more than a month away. So I think we are going to have another sellout event here. So if you do want to buy, please do buy sooner rather than later, because I don't want to disappoint people. At our last event, we did have some disappointed Line listeners because we did run out of seats for, legally permitted seats for people. So do consider buying those tickets. It's going to be a really interesting event.
Besides, I mean, all the people in and around Edmonton, you don't want to get out partied by Calgary, do you? I mean, nobody rocks like Shelbyville. So we'll have fun in Edmonton. No, it's going to be a really interesting conversation about the state of the world around us, but there'll be food. So it's going to be
good food. We're getting it nicely catered,
but great for your stomach.
It's going to be classy. Like I said, we're classing up this joint. It's going to be great.
That's all we do. The Line, all about class. All right. Do you want to feel old?
Yes, always. I always want to go
hang out with university students.
No, I don't want to hang out with university students.
They're anymore. So young. Oh my God. So young. Or I guess they're actually the same age they've always been. It's just I'm not.
Yeah.
I went. So obviously this week, Jen, like everybody all over the world, I've been watching the encampments in the United States, where at Columbia in New York, where Justin Ling went down last weekend to cover that for us. And then particularly at UCLA in Los Angeles, where things got quite nasty. Mm-hmm. The cops have been going in and they've been breaking up these entrenched encampments. And we have one in Canada. Well, we have a series of them, but we had the first one at McGill. And when we record this, we're recording this for me very early in the afternoon on Friday and for Jen late in the morning. There's been no activity at McGill, but Francois Legault has been calling for activity, and the Montreal police are massing. So I don't know if that's a show of force or if that's an imminent operation, but we're waiting to see. In Toronto, my hometown, the University of Toronto just had one of those encampments pop up. It popped up overnight between Wednesday and Thursday, so about 36 hours ago-ish, before we were sat down to record this. I'd been meaning, Jen, and some listeners had asked for this, I'd been meaning to actually spend a lot more time in some of these Palestinian protests, the pro-Palestinian protests. Mm-hmm. I have been in them, but I've been in them, I don't want to say casually, because it's not a casual thing, but I had not kind of really cleared a block of time to go deep. I've had opportunities to join them, to march with them, to listen to what they're saying, take some photos, things like that. But I have not had the chance to really invest in it. As you well know, you and I have just been very busy the last few months. But I had a window of time yesterday to say, I'm going to U of T. I'm clearing the schedule. I'm going to go there. Interesting experience down at King's Circle at the University of Toronto.
So firstly, let's just talk about it. What happened?
Let me take a minute or two and just set the stage, and
Okay.
let me describe this. Now, obviously, Torontonians and U of T grads will know this. University of Toronto is a gorgeous old campus. It's beautiful, and it's right in the heart of downtown. This protest is about 100 meters from the Ontario legislature, so it's like
Mm-hmm.
right in the heart of the city.
Mm-hmm.
It is in the heart of the campus. They're surrounded by old buildings, and it is kind of a loop road. Like all the different roads in the campus lead up to this loop. And inside that loop, it's sort of a rounded quad, is a huge open space, just green grass, nice trees. Sidewalks are twisting through it for pedestrians, and there's benches. It's a gorgeous area. I've spent time in there just when I was a young man. Like I had friends at U of T, and it was just like you could go out there and throw down a picnic blanket kind of thing. A few days ago, the university administration fenced off the entire quad. They had surrounded it with fencing, and they said that this was to protect the grass for the upcoming convocation ceremonies. I think that's true, but I also think they were not blind to the fact that what was happening elsewhere. And overnight on Wednesday to Thursday morning, protesters dismantled one segment of the fence, ran in with their supplies, set up an encampment right in the middle. And this is like, I know this is, I'm focusing on the geography here. They've put their tents right in the middle. And then they established a barricade at the fence gap that they'd opened. It's a human barricade. It's just people standing there with a banner and they're blocking it.
Okay.
But the effect of this is that the tents are well back from the fence line. You cannot stand at the fence line and talk to the people who are encamped. It's just too far.
Sure.
The fence line itself otherwise is intact. It is now covered in posters and whatnot. We'll talk about the posters in a minute. And I'm just sketching the scene of it here. I walked the loop of the thing a bunch of times. For huge stretches of it, it's just a fence. There's no one camped near the fence. There's no posters on it. You can see the encampment in the middle, but it's just kind of like you're walking down a construction site. But at the where they removed that fence segment to gain entry, it's kind of become an impromptu gathering place. So there's a lot more posters there. There's a lot more. I describe it as graffiti, but what I specifically mean is sidewalk chalk on the roads and all the sidewalks, slogans and things written down there. At the entrance, just inside of it, there are a series of folding tables that have been set up as sort of a reception and screening area. And then just outside, so that's inside the fence, just outside the fence, 100, maybe 200 people like me, looking around, gawking, taking pictures, talking. A couple of the old hippie activist types, like long, increasingly gray-haired guys, probably been doing this since Vietnam. Folding tables set up with literature of what I would call generically left-wing causes. A lot of, obviously, Palestinian-oriented stuff, but not exclusively. And I didn't get the sense most of the people who were out there were political activists. I think a lot of them were students having a lunch break or grabbing a smoke. People walking their dogs or going for a jog. And then I think there's a lot of people showing up for pictures. I did try to get into the encampment, and I was denied access.
You can't pass as a student anymore, can you?
No.
Nor as not even as a hippie. You need to like grow your beard out considerably more. And
I have a funny story I'm going to tell you in a minute exactly about that. But
they can smell the conservatism off of you, Matt.
The Zionism, I think. I did have my press ID with me.
Mm-hmm.
I chose yesterday not to use it. I went as a civilian. I wasn't trying to interview people. I just wanted to eyeball it. Just walk around, didn't talk to anybody. I just kind of wanted to get a sense of the lay of the land. But there was a group of people being admitted into the inner part. I just kind of got in line.
Mm-hmm.
And as I tried to go through, they're like, "Oh, hi, how are you? Are you affiliated with the campus?" And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" They're like, "Well, it's a restricted access area." And I said, "Oh, who gets in?" And they said, "Well, anyone who can be vouched for by people who are on the inside." I said, "Oh, no, that's not me." And then they, "Oh, are you faculty?" I'm like, "No," which was, faculty is more likely than student. I acknowledge that. I said, "No." And they said, "Are you a student here? Are you taking any courses?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, we're sorry, we're limiting access to the interior." And I went, "Oh, okay, thanks." I didn't fuss. Like, I wasn't there to cause any problems. I just wanted to check things out. Want to know what happened next?
What happened next?
So I stepped back. And again, no fuss, very polite, everybody incredibly civil.
Mm-hmm.
They were nervous, the students at the barrier. Oh, and the barrier, by the way, is a gigantic banner that they're holding against the gap in the fence, and the banner says "From the river to the sea."
Okay.
So we'll talk more about this in a minute. So I stepped back and I just kind of observed. Like, I just kind of watched it. I took a bunch of pictures, what was going on. And then I realized I was being followed. On the inside of the fence perimeter, a very nervous-looking young woman who was doing her absolute best to pretend like she was not mirroring my every move was mirroring my every move. And I spotted her immediately because she's not very good at this. And she was pretending to pay me no attention, but also texting animatedly. And after about a minute, on the outside of the fence where I was, a woman around the same age was suddenly always within 20 feet of me. Mm-hmm. And they were looking at each other, trying to do it subtly, but it wasn't subtle. And they were not looking at me. And I decided to walk 50 feet down the fence. And wouldn't you know it, they drifted with me. And I stopped, and they stopped. And I went 20 feet back the way I'd come, and they moved 20 feet back. And this went on for about 5 or 10 minutes.
They correctly identified you as sus, as the kids say today.
And I wasn't bothered. They were not threatening or bothering me in any way. They were keeping a considerable distance from me. But what I eventually did was I just turned around. I made direct eye contact with the one who was outside the fence, and I just walked up to her, and I kind of just did this.
Also not unsus.
And she and the one on the inside immediately pivoted and walked away. They think I'm a cop.
You do give off cop vibes.
I know I do.
Yeah,
it's not deliberate, but I do.
Nope.
And there was no visible Toronto police presence at all. Mm-hmm. Now, there probably were Toronto police there, and they were probably grateful for me being there because I was drawing all the attention off of them. Mm-hmm. But I think they thought I was a cop, and they followed
here's
me
the hint,
around.
kids. If somebody's going to send a cop in,
they don't look like me.
They don't look like Matt Gurney. They're a little better than that.
Yep. So I almost wanted to say to the young woman who was outside the fence, who was half my height and half my weight and half my age, I wanted to say to her, young lady, when they come, they won't be as obvious as I am. And every moment you're spending looking at me, there's someone out here who is really grateful for that because they're getting the goods.
Yeah.
But
so what was your? I find it very funny because when you came back from that, you gave me kind of a military history kind of nerd assessment of their defensive perimeter, and I wanted you to write something about that, but do it from the place of Walter from The Big Lebowski. Like, I wanted Walter from The Big Lebowski energy from you.
I've never seen The Big Lebowski.
Well, we're going to have to fix that.
It's on my list. Don't worry.
Yes.
It's on my list.
All right. Anyway.
No, look, so two things to mention. First of all, yes, the encampment is tactically vulnerable. If the Toronto police want to clear this thing out, it's going to be a cakewalk. It's funny. There's so the school put up the fencing and seemed to think, aha, well, these protesters they'll never get through this fence. I was looking at the fence. Me, one other guy, and a hammer could dismantle this fence. The fencing is of the kind where every segment is simply lowered in to form a seal with the one next to it. With a sledgehammer or even just a normal hammer, you go pop, pop. You just knock that thing out and then you push it down. Like, you could dismantle this fence with two guys and a hammer can take this fence down. But also, what I don't know if these protesters realize. So first of all, the students played the school. The protesters played the school because they turned the fence into their own barricade. The students are now safe behind the fence line until the police decide to simply kettle them inside. Yeah. In which case, the fence is yet again working against them. The police just need to surround that thing, and they don't need to go in heavy. They just need to let people out, but never let anyone in. Yeah, and after a couple of days or weeks, you're going to have a pretty pissed off group.
I don't think it's going to take days or weeks. Come on now, Matt.
Well, that's okay. So let's talk about that.
Do we really think that they've stockpiled water and food in the encampment?
let's talk about that.
Okay.
I did not get into the encampment, but a University of Toronto professor did, and he did. I tweeted his thread yesterday. Check it out. It is
Okay.
fantastic reportage from a econ professor who basically said, I'm a like-minded anti-Zionist comrade. I just want to congratulate you guys, and they let him write in. He walked around and he came out, and this guy, I've spoken to him just a little bit, totally off the record, so I'm not gonna reveal anything we've spoken about. But I believe him when he said he had no political agenda and going. He's a U of T prof, and it was in front.
Yeah, I want to see what's going on my campus. Yeah.
And he observed publicly in his Twitter thread that to call this a student protest is wrong. There are a lot of students there, and everyone I was interacting with was a student. But he says inside, it's not students. It's much older people, much more experienced organizers. So do I have faith that these students knew how to prepare for a kettled multi-day or multi-week encampment? No. Are there experienced street organizers in there who probably know what they're doing? Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
So and I think what we've seen in the United States already is when the cops finally go in and make arrests, half or fewer of these kids are students. There's a lot of professional, and look, I know this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but I did note the same thing that other people have been noting at other protests. Dozens of identical brand new tents is a non-trivial cash outlay. There's a mix in that group of older tents, but dozens of them, and exactly matching models, brand new.
Yeah.
Not a
Somebody went to Canadian Tire, and like those things are about what, 200 up to 400, depending on the tent model, $200 to $400
I think that
a tent.
sounds about right. As a guy with a nice big tent, it was $400. You could get
plus
a smaller model.
Plus, then you also are going to need some other camping equipment if you don't have the equipment, and if you don't have the tent, you probably also don't have the sleeping bag and the sleeping whatever. So yeah,
you're looking at thousands, possibly tens of thousands of dollars of money that was spent suddenly and without the detection of university officials. I'm not jumping to any conspiracy theories here, but there is a degree of command and control here that is not the usual U of T student group. And there's that.
There's a couple things that I find very interesting about these student groups in general, and that is the degree to which we have a social contagion phenomenon happening across these campuses. I don't say that to necessarily neither undermine nor promote their message or their goal, but I think watching social contagion in action is a really fascinating process in and of itself. So there's that going on, and I think that a lot of what's spurring the sense on, from at least from the student side, is the sense that no, we're going to be a part of history, we're going to be a part of this movement. I think that all student groups, basically since the '60s on, have been trying to
60s moment.
Yeah, they're trying to recreate the emotional high of the '60s in some degree, and I can say that because I've felt that impulse too. I totally get it. A lot of these people think like, well, we're on the right side of history. We're doing the right thing for the right reasons. We're not going to fail in the long run. Student protests are always successful in the long run. I mean, what I think a lot of people don't realize is that, in fact, a lot of successful student protests have failed. They were on the wrong side of history, and what tends to happen is that the student protests that happen to align themselves with the right side of history in the long run get remembered, but the ones that don't align themselves with the right side of history get forgotten or memory hold. And oftentimes even some of the more horrific stuff that we see from protesters who were on the right side of history gets memory hold as well. People have very rose-colored views of a lot of the '60s counterculture movements, right? There were dark, harder edges in those counterculture movements as well.
Yeah, a lot of stuff got blown up.
A lot of stuff got blown up, absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think, I mean, you and I are also old enough to remember the Occupy protests.
I want to talk about that.
Because we remember these. I covered the Occupy protests here in Calgary. You covered the Occupy protests. So I think that strikes me as being more analogous to what we're seeing here. And I think that with the judgment of history, we can see that the Occupy protests really went nowhere, frankly. I wonder if what we're seeing now is almost a revivification of the emotional high of the Occupy protests for a lot of these older protesters as well. So that's interesting to me. But I would also flag for people that I do think in this case that a lot of what's happening on these campuses is indicative of a real collapse of Israeli support, especially among the younger demographic. We do see that collapse quite consistently falling on demographic lines along polling data. So even if the particular kids engaged in these protests don't make sympathetic figures or don't cut sympathetic figures for people, they are highly indicative of, I think, a shift in public sentiment in North America. That if I were connected to Israel, or if I were worried about, my long-term support, the long-term support of the American military and political establishment in Israel, this stuff would concern me, because it does suggest to me that there is a demographic shift coming. And as this demographic starts to get, 10, 15, 20 years out from now, a lot of the sort of unquestioned support that America currently has for Israel is going to be questioned, and it is going to be debated in a way that we're not used to, for people of our age aren't used to.
I agree. I'm going to endorse all of that. A few other points on the protest I want to make. You and I spoke last week about the differences and the similarities between the convoy and the Gazan protests.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 7 days in between then, the Gazan protesters have decided to start emulating the convoy. And I know it's not like a direct emulation, because it's not parliament or it's not border crossings. But, a week ago, the argument was, you can't compare the two. It's transient marches through the streets.
Well, now
it's occupations.
Right.
And I want to tell you, I want to read a few things to you verbatim. So for listeners, they're not going to know this, but for podcast viewers on YouTube, indulge me here. I'm pulling up some of the signs I photographed where I was there, Jen. I just want to read them to you.
Sure.
And I think for the video, we can include some of these photos, which I took yesterday. Now, to be clear, a lot of these signs are completely bog standard. Freedom for Gaza. Palestinians deserve a homeland. Stop the killing. I would say the majority of the posters are banal, left-leaning slogans that are what you'd expect to support a Palestinian cause. There's also, of course, and I won't dwell on this, but there's also the mixture of other... You know the way this works. Any protest movement draws the hangers on. So I also saw some environmental posters, some indigenous land back posters, some LGBTQ rights posters, et cetera, et cetera. But I was there with a mind of deciding, is this encampment threatening? And I personally did not feel threatened being there.
Mm-hmm.
But then I read a sign that reads quite simply, "Glory to the martyrs."
Oh.
Then I'm scrolling through my pictures here.
Now I know we're going to get some devil's advocates saying that the martyrs they're referring to, that the martyrs that they're referring to aren't necessarily the terrorists. They're the children who is given Gaza. Okay.
Sure.
This
is, by the way, quote again. I don't mean the podcast is what I'm about to say, but this is a sign. And I saw several versions of this and photographed several versions of this. This is the Intifada.
Oh.
Right. And again, devil's advocate. They mean jihad means struggle. Debate 20
not
years
necessarily
ago.
The violence. Okay.
All right. Let's keep going.
Intifada
as I
also
mentioned,
being traditionally associated with suicide bombing waves in the 90s, but that's fine.
That's okay. As I've already mentioned, the barrier sign, at least when I was there, where students... Got the photo here. How many of them are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 students holding up a large banner as the gate where the fence segment has been removed. The banner reads quite simply, "From the river to the sea." Okay. Then I began to pay more attention. So those are the signs. Then I began to pay more attention to the graffiti, the sidewalk chalk. Again, most of the slogans are banal. Stop the killing, divest from Israel, blah, blah, blah. The people united will never be defeated, that old chestnut. Among others was a simple, "We will return."
Return where?
And who is we?
And
inquiring minds want to know. So, okay. We are the Intifada again. Another one of those. Where's that great one? Here's one. All the Zionists are racists. All the Zionists are terrorists.
Oh.
And then, the last one that I wish to bring to your attention, "Leave Palestine alone and go back to Europe."
Oh,
Palestine, for listeners and viewers, is an Arabic term used interchangeably as Palestine. So, in direct English translation, leave Palestine alone and go back to Europe.
okay.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, there's another sign that I'm going to flag for people's attention. I don't think this was in the U of T quad, but it was, I think, noted in the McGill quad. It was noted by Jesse Brown, or Jesse Brown brought my attention to it. So, posted at the front of one of these encampments was this long letter from ostensibly from
I
the
saw
Mohawk,
this.
from like the
Yeah.
one of the Mohawk councils, that said we give permission to the protesters to occupy Turtle Island in pursuit of blah 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 blah, and it was signed by someone by the name of Stuart Myo, Myo. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I apologize. But it later came out, or was found, that Mr. Stewart is a rather notorious and fairly extraordinary anti-Semite who doesn't really represent the Mohawk anything. Um, but the campers had put this sign up right at the end, like they were chosen to identify this guy, and he's quite a vicious anti-Semite, and I believe a Holocaust denier who talks about how Hitler should have finished the job in a couple of his public postings. So, like, do I think that person represents all of the people in this encampment? Probably not. But it is someone whom they are choosing to align themselves with and to give a platform to as part of their movement, and that's a choice.
Well,
So,
let's talk about choices. Yeah, let's talk about choices,
well,
because
and
one of
the
the
other thing,
things.
the one thing I do want to say is, like, just from my personal point of view, protesters taking over a university quad in an encampment, I think probably should be some toleration for that in a free and democratic society that's willing to tolerate protests. Where you start to lose me on these encampments is where I start to see videos of kids basically blocking off access to school facilities like libraries and saying you can't go in if you're a Zionist. Like, that for me is really over the line, because now you don't actually have the right to block your fellow classmates access to these schools. Also, there have been lots of reports of Jewish students in these connected to or on campus feeling intimidated in other schools. I think that's obviously very, very inappropriate. So that's where I think that the school and civic societies at broader have an obligation to step in and ensure that school is a safe environment for all students, including Jewish students. Personally, self-contained encampments as part of a protest, I think is mostly pretty normal in campus life. However, there's always a risk that these things can escalate, or they can start to attract really nasty elements,
I
or
want to
they
talk
can.
about that. Can we put a pin
Yeah,
on that just for a minute?
yeah. Let's put a pin on that.
Because I completely agree, but I want
Yeah,
to make one final comment about the graffiti and the signs.
yeah.
One of the things we've heard over the course of these protests has been, you can't blame 3,000 marchers parading down University Avenue or down Wellington Street in Ottawa, or whatever it happens to be. You can't Sherbrooke in Montreal. You can't blame thousands of protesters for what one guy yells through a megaphone.
Okay.
And I agree.
But what if they're all yelling it?
Or what if there's a sign at the gate of the encampment
From
that
a
is making a claim that is arguably, and with all respect for the devil's advocates who would like to explain to me the nuance of what all Zionists or terrorists mean,
mm-hmm.
at a certain point, there is a group of people who are not marching because they saw a sad picture of a baby with its brains blown out. They're choosing to associate themselves with the people who are telling Jews to go back to Europe, which is an explicit call for ethnic cleansing or worse. Everyone who wants to go to this encampment has every right to do that. But I am saying the writing is literally on the wall, or in the sidewalk in this case, and you will be judged by that standard. That's my whole point on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I do want to talk about exactly what you're saying there, Jen, because you're right. I remember we were both at the National Post in 2010. You were at Occupy Calgary. I was at Occupy Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it went in Calgary, so I'll let you tell that story. But let me tell you how it went in Toronto. Day one, party. Incredible atmosphere, excitement, jubilation, cheerfulness, cooperation. Young people coming together full of all the energy of youth to change the world for the better. Throw down the tents, get organized, meet new people, excitedly exchange email addresses. Was fun. A week later, some of the enthusiasm had waned a little bit because it had been cold and rainy, but it was still pretty good. A week after that, after some pretty steady rain, and every wanted criminal in Toronto who was staying below the radar had moved into the encampment, and the homeless people had moved into the encampment. A lot of those students decided to realize, you know what, this actually sucks. And they left. And all those tents were taken over by the homeless and a hard-edged activist, professional activist element, and increasingly a criminal element. And I think the third time I went back, I saw one of the guys I'd been speaking to the whole time. I was going back about once a week. And I said to him, hey, how's it going? And I dug up my old National Post column about this. And he had to admit sheepishly that for a bunch of anti-institutional fuck the government types, they'd had to repeatedly call the cops because some of the young female students had been sexually assaulted by the newcomers.
Yeah.
When I went to the encampment in Toronto yesterday, like the good Torontonian I am, I took the TTC. Took it both ways. And on my ride down, there was a man on that train who was screaming. He wasn't threatening anybody, but he was screaming. And on the way back, there was a man on that train who was also screaming, but he wasn't just screaming into the void. He was in the face of 3 young Asian women screaming, I'm going to cut your fucking face, bitches. I'm going to fuck you up. And then at the next station, that guy got off the train and ran. People are using the TTC right now as an auxiliary to Toronto's mental health hospitals and homeless shelter system because the system's been completely overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. So my question, Jen, it's not for you, it's for the University of Toronto administrators. In the next week or two, who's going to be leaving that encampment? Yeah. And who's going to replace them? Yeah. How long until instead of a pro-Palestinian student-led protest on the quad in front of King's Circle, are you going to have an open-air mental health hospital and homeless encampment in the downtown of heart of Toronto in the middle of your campus? Mm-hmm. My advice to the University of Toronto, Jen, and I hear what you're saying about having an open mind to students seizing quads. Having seen Occupy Toronto radicalize and having seen the convoy radicalize, my advice to the administration of the University of Toronto, clear this thing out tonight. And if you can't do it tonight, do it tomorrow. Because it's going to get worse. I mean, and I know it'll pop up somewhere. I know that.
Calgary,
just don't let it be on your lawn.
Yeah, Calgary was an interesting case. Calgary was a bit weirder and more benign. I mean, the guys who wound up, it was small, but also by the end of the day, with the people who wound up leaving, left like a weird art sculpture behind them. Like it was kind of cool. So I kind of liked them, but we didn't get the same hard edge stuff in Calgary as elsewhere. So I don't think that's necessarily where these protests have to go. And I'm sympathetic to the sense that, you know, there are a lot of people out there who don't want to see this turn into. They don't want to see this turn into Kent State. They don't want to see police come in here and bust heads. Not only because obviously that's just not an appropriate way to deal with this a lot of the time, but it's just going to metastasize if you do that. You make these kids martyrs, you make the cause martyrs, you actually add energy into this movement, and you'll actually spread the social contagion, right? So there's arguments against doing that as well. So I don't know, Matt. I tend to think that these things almost have to get to a point where they become an obvious safety threat and problem before you have the justification required to move in and clear them out.
That's the political ass-covering justification. As a matter of practicality, yes, I agree with you. But as a guy who's read a history book and has seen some of it with his own eyes, I don't think we need to make the same mistake every time.
Yeah, fair enough. Anyway, like and subscribe to the line.
Like and subscribe. And honestly, for anyone in Toronto, if you've got the time this weekend, I know the weather's not going to be great. Go check it out. Like it's not a threatening environment, or at least not a dangerous environment on the outside. It might become that, but if you've got the time, go check it out. We'll post some of our pictures, and you might run into me there. I'll be heading back. I'll be in Ottawa for a few days next week, but on the weekend I'm going to try and slip down again. Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. So Matt, how do we explain the Wacko in Parliament situation? Because on one hand, I don't even want to humor this. By treating it remotely seriously. But on the other hand, Ottawa lost its goddamn mind this week with something that no one who doesn't live in Ottawa and is deeply politically engaged gives any shits about. So there was an altercation in the House of Commons in which the Conservatives, and particularly Pierre Poilievre, was challenging the Liberal government's record on some drug decriminalization issues. What's happened is BC has effectively decriminalized possessions of certain drugs a couple of years ago. Clearly, it's gone to to pot. Clearly, it's gone to pot because the NDP BC government is like, whoa, maybe we shouldn't have totally decriminalized
Yeah.
possession because now there are people smoking crack everywhere.
Even in the center of the universe, I listened to Premier Eby's press conference, and that was a masterpiece in backing down without trying to sound like you're backing down.
That's right. So now they're asking the federal government, but however, their attempts to recriminalize the drugs have been held up in court. There's been an injunction put in place. So now
Yeah.
the provincial government is trying to work with the federal government to effectively recriminalize these drugs. However, they're finding that the federal government is stalling. So you've got the BC government, the BC NDP government, far left government, trying to say, yeah, we went too far, guys, please help. And the liberals are saying, but our beautiful decriminalization plans, we don't know what we want to do. So in the midst of stalling on these issues, you've got Pierre Poilievre coming to Parliament and calling the Prime Minister and his policies, quote unquote, wacko. At this point, the Speaker of the House, Fergus, challenged Poilievre and said, that's unparliamentary language, walk it back. Pierre kind of sort of walked it back, but not enough. And anyway, as a result of all of this, it wound up with Pierre Poilievre getting kicked out of the House of Parliament for using unparliamentary language. And of course, the first thing that all the Conservatives did is they all walk out with him and they start sending out their email fundraising campaigns. And I'm sure those were very successful for them. So anyway, this is very much inside baseball Ottawa bullshit. The word wacko has been used in Parliament before without it leading to a parliamentary expulsion. That's true. There have also been multiple other parliamentary expulsions over unparliamentary language. There have been worse examples of unparliamentary language, including, I believe, at one point, rather infamously, Trudeau was once accused of calling Peter Kent a piece of shit. And elbowing a boob. Like, these things happen. People get expelled. People get worked up. Absolutely happened. Should Fergus have kicked Pierre out? Probably not. But also, when the Speaker of the House tells you that's unparliamentary language, walk it back, you walk it back.
It's not optional.
It's not optional. So, like, nobody comes out looking great here. The Conservatives win the point just on the virtue of the fact that they were able to play martyr and turn it into a fundraising coup for themselves. In fact, by the way, as an aside, the Conservatives are killing it on the fundraising campaign. I think the latest quarter's fundraising report came out, and they're just out fundraising the Liberals like 3 to 1, like 3 to 10. Like, I think the Liberals pulled in 3 million and the Conservatives pulled in 10 million. So clearly this is working for them. It's not going to make a single dent in their 20-point lead, which has turned out to be incredibly durable. The attack ads the Liberals are now launching against Pierre are getting more and more desperate and thin as every week passes by. And I don't know what else to say about this. There's a lot of hyperventilating in the Ottawa circles about all of this. One commentator, I think fairly absurdly, called this a dark day for democracy. No, it's not.
If we're thinking of the same one, I think she said it. We will remember this day in our history books.
No, we won't. No, we're not even going to remember this next week. No, it's not. This is very much. This is a very, very Ottawa bubble story, is what this actually is. However, it was worth mentioning because it was worth mentioning, and I think that actually what I thought was interesting in all of this is not necessarily the wacko Parliament and all the drama, but what was worth mentioning in it was that. One of the friends of the line, whom we have an op-ed coming from, so I'm not going to spoil it too much, but one of the friends of the line made this note to me about something that the Liberals had slipped into their budget bill. They'd slipped in some changes that would basically allow the Minister of Health, I believe, to make sort of unilateral by-order changes to what they deem therapeutic products that are deemed to be a risk to health. And our friend said that he believes that this is aimed at certain kinds of tobacco and drug products that are therapeutic. It's designed to allow the minister to effectively circumvent the regulatory process to deem certain products, like, for example, nicotine pouches or MDMA, harmful, like the therapeutic versions of these drugs, harmful for health and human consumption, and therefore to put in all these kinds of very strict sale and advertising regimes around them. Firstly, that's a hell of a thing to slip into a goddamn budget bill. That's the sort of change that should not be slipped into a budget bill, guys. That's the sort of change that really should be done openly in Parliament. You want to give your minister that kind of power over therapeutic, quote unquote, therapeutic products. That's something that should be highlighted and dealt with. And I just thought that it was incredibly ironic that you have the federal government kind of doubling down on their highly emotionally charged um, war on things like nicotine and MDMA, while at the same time stalling on recriminalizing crack and heroin. I just find that completely like my kingdom for irrational drug policy, people. Like I don't know what to say. Like the fact that we have, and I've written about this in the past, but the fact that we have these governments trying to go all full on destigmatization, full on legalization, full on harm reduction on some of the substances that we know are most harmful for human consumption, and also most harmful for the societies that permit them to be consumed en masse. Yet we retain this like legacy, almost religious hatred for substances like nicotine or substances like I said, MDMA or psychedelics, right? Like this is insane to me. This is
I,
completely irrational to me. I cannot understand why we do this. But it's there. And I just find that the hypocrisy of this to be just glaring and problematic. And like, the drama of getting kicked out of the house aside, the conservatives are actually doing their jobs here. They're right to point out that this shit is wacko. It is like when the BC NDP is saying we've gone too far, guys. Read the room.
yeah, well, look,
Stop.
there's two bits of broader context to this, which I'll just mention. One of them is the fact that Ontario and Toronto public health officials are exploring adopting the BC model. Now, people
Great.
who generally have followed what's been happening in this continent with opioids know that it's been a left to right phenomenon. It started in the Pacific, and it's been only gradually working its way through
Mm-hmm.
the continent. And it's you can literally track the eastward creep of opioid deaths.
Mm-hmm.
And Toronto has not had it as bad as Vancouver,
Mm-hmm.
but it's ticking up. It's arriving. And I think our officials don't know what to do, and they're looking at it, and they're looking at what BC's trying, and they're doing it right as BC's withdrawing. So I think
Yeah.
that's some of the context that Poilievre was speaking to about wanting the Prime Minister or the government to reject Toronto's consideration of a similar legal
Mm.
regime as Vancouver. But I also think the other context, and I might get accused of downplaying this, and I don't mean it that way, because I think we spoke about the encampment visit with the Diagolon weirdos last week.
Last
Now we're
week.
talking about this. I might be accused of downplaying this here, but I'm actually going to link these two issues. I think Pierre Poilievre's tired. I think he needs a vacation. I
Mm.
think he's been going across the country for a long time. I think he's exhausted, he's burnt out, and I think he's reading all the polls. And the latest one, the Liberals did not get a post budget bounce. Poilievre has gone up.
Yep.
And I think a combination of fatigue and exhaustion and probably starting
Giddiness.
to, he's measuring the drapes of the PMO office a year and a
Mm-hmm.
half before he's even been elected. And I think he needs a vacation, and the party would be well advised to send him and the wife, but not the kids, to a beach resort somewhere. But don't let him take his phone or his computer with him, and bring him back in not even a week, 3 or 4 days. I think he's fucking up, and I think he's coming unglued a bit. But I would also say that some of the context you didn't mention, Jen, is that before that testy exchange in the House, the PM was accusing him of standing with white supremacists and
Oh, fair
supporting the
enough. Yeah.
far right nationalists.
So the idea that your drug policy is wacko is unparliamentary, and yet the opposition leader getting accused of like having fealty to a tiny little weird quasi crazy ass movement that no
We
conservatives ever heard of.
In the written dispatch, we'll grab the Hansard
All
recordings of
right.
this. My contextual takeaway of all of this, an underappreciated element in Canadian politics right now, Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre cannot fucking stand each other.
Yes.
And they have often been able to hide that, at least kind of behind the facade of parliamentary decorum, but they're both tired. They're both exhausted. Trudeau senses impending defeat. Poilievre is smelling impending victory,
This is also
and
why
they're both getting sloppy.
This is also why Trudeau can't leave. By the way. I honestly think that 90% of the reason why he's not going to quit and can't quit, like psychologically,
Because he
is,
hates Poilievre.
yeah, it's personal animus. Literally, it's just he hates that twerp and he just cannot stomach the idea of backing down
It's going to
against a
get
fight
worse.
against that dude. That dude he
Yep.
despises. That's why he's not going to go anywhere.
And we've got
He's going to
18
ride,
more months of this.
and he's going to ride this out for 18 more goddamn months, and every week is going to get more and more ridiculous. All I have to say to this entire debacle, this whole Wacko thing, is a giant, emphatic eye roll. All of you people need to grow up. But you're not going to, and I've accepted that. I've moved on. I've moved on in my heart.
Imagine 18 months of this.
Oh no,
Because
it's
there used to be a defined
completely
political silly
ridiculous.
season, right? Like
Yes,
by
it was
December,
June and December. Yes,
I think by
it's
November of
May,
last
guys.
fall, I think the hatred and the polarization has moved forward the start of silly season.
I
These
think you're
guys
right.
hate each other so much.
Mm-hmm. They hate each
We
other
only
so
got a
much.
couple minutes left before we got to take a quick break. I just want to mention Pierre Poilievre had an op-ed in the National Post this week. While we're talking about Poilievre, I think he's coming unglued in some of his public communications, like when he's off the cuff. I think he needs a break. That op-ed in the National Post I thought was interesting. You probably read it. He's basically saying lobbyists, business associations, fuck you. You've cozied up to the government. I'm not going to do your bidding. You're not going to be able to lobby me. If you want to make a change, make the case to the people, and the people will tell us what to do. It's interesting. I know for a fact it has sent shockwaves through Ottawa. I also don't believe it.
Firstly, I hope that he's serious, and I hope he can follow through on that. Great, because I mean, this country has become up its own ass, and effectively is increasingly ceasing to function as an actual proper nation because of this shit. And this
too much power clustered in too much
power clustered in too many places. And yes, he's right. He's correctly identified one of Canada's key issues around basically productivity and growth, is that the way you actually get ahead in Canada is you hire a lobbyist to get a specialized government contract. That has to stop. Otherwise the country is going to get really, well, it's already getting borked. So yes, no, he's correct. He's right. He needs to take a goddamn chainsaw to the whole system, and we need to get back to, businesses and trade organizations that are functioning for the purposes that they're supposed to be functioning for, and not existing for their own sake, and not engaging in sort of this internal rent-seeking regulatory capture model of an economy that we currently have set up in this country. I hope he takes a chainsaw to it. However,
I invite him to start with the dairy cartel as a sign of his seriousness.
As a sign of your seriousness, please feel free to break up supply management. Until then, you're quite correct. It's just words. The other thing too is free the cheese. The other thing I would point out is it's naive to think that the GR agencies and the lobbyists and all of these organizations aren't going to shift focus the second he's in power. They're just going to suck up and butter up the Conservatives and him in exactly the same way they've sucked up and buttered up the Liberals. And
if they can't get to him, they'll get to the staff, and they'll get to the cabinet ministers, and they'll get to the donors.
Of course they will. So I think they're going to have to change their business model. They're going to have to change how they approach this under a Pierre Poilievre government. But the idea that you're ever going to create a system that is able to break up the power of lobbyists, I mean, I think that we do need to try. I agree, we need to try, but that's not. It's almost a bit naive. I don't know. You're right.
You know what it is?
Right. You know what? You're right. Let's see him start with dairy. Let's see him start with big dairy.
I'm going to say something that's going to piss the Poilievre supporters off. You said It's a bit naive. You know what it is?
What?
It is the product of a lifetime spent in politics. Poilievre's never been anything but a politician. If he had spent some time in the private sector, he would understand full well how that capital and influence is going to flow. So, naive, maybe. I think more just inexperienced.
But he's not inexperienced. And also, I think being a politician all of his life ought to have given him, above a lot of other people, a really good front seat view in terms of how money, capital, and influence works in Ottawa. And the way,
he knows it from his end.
And the way that certain industries, people, and regions get cut out of that cycle and process. So, I hope that he's coming into this with good intentions. I hope that he can actually break some stuff up, but you're quite correct. Until we see him actually break up supply management, it's bullshit.
like, and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. There we go.
I'm going to be immature for this next segment. I'm going to let you set it up because I feel like I talked way too much in that first segment. I did the heavy lifting there.
Matt, we like it. We like it that you talk a lot. It's part of your charm.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm told. Tell me about Bill Blair. I have the joke. I'm ready with the joke. I'm ready to make fun of this. Can you set up what Bill Blair said? So there was a defense conference in Ottawa this week. Bill Blair was talking to Dave Perry from the Canadian Government Affairs Institute. Dave is a really good national security guy. He comes on my radio show, and I've published him before. They're talking about the problems, the challenges, and the opportunities facing Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces. If you're interested in this thing, go listen to the interview. Like, if this is your bread and butter in the way it is for me, go check it out. I did. But you're not as fanatic about the stuff as I am, and one of the lines jumped out at you and amused you, and I have a joke ready to go. So you have to set this up for me. What is it that Bill Blair said?
Well, Bill Blair said, essentially, and I'm just quoting directly from the story here, that it's hard to convince Cabinet and Canadians that meeting NATO spending targets is a worthy goal because, quote, nobody knows what that means. Instead, he said Wednesday, he's trying to argue that Canada must do more. So he's making an argument that we need to increase our spending on defense. Currently, it's about 1.33%. And in the last 2 weeks or so, I think they've announced more spending that would bring it into the 1.76% range. However, that's still short of our 2% goal. So Bill says, so he's noting, I have to keep pushing my issue forward. He's trying to convince Cabinet that it's important for us to meet our commitments. And this is his quote, trying to go to Cabinet or even Canadians and tell them that we had to do this because we need to beat this magical threshold of 2%, ... Don't get me wrong, it's important, but it was really hard to convince people that this was a worthy goal and that that was some noble standard that we had to meet.
Okay, so I'm going to make the serious comment first, okay?
Sure. All right.
All he has to do is convince Canadians and his cabinet colleagues that our word has fucking value because we have repeatedly pledged to meet the 2% target. And remember, this is the problem this particular government has. The problem these Liberals in particular have is that if they are going to be the champions against misinfo and disinfo, they are setting themselves up where I am not prepared to give them the benefit of what I will call the normal political lie. Politicians lie. Politicians bullshit me. I get it. And there's also an art of rhetoric and creative interpretation that goes hand in hand with politics. But when you're the misinfo, disinfo champions, and you make a public commitment to hit 2%, and you don't really mean it, that's misinfo and disinfo. Go fuck yourselves. So that's the serious comment.
Can I just even say it's even simpler than that? Because I mean, the 2% target, how long? Like, we made the 2% target commitment how many decades ago?
I'd have to go find out. It was one of the summits years ago. We can find that. This
is a very, very old thing that we have consistently failed to meet over multiple successive governments. This is not new. It's gotten particularly bad under Trudeau, but like Canada's really been a bit of a laggard on defense spending, essentially since the Trudeau era, when we decided that we wanted to be a welfare state more than we wanted to be militarily powerful. And so we took the sorts of monies that we would normally put into defense spending, and we essentially channeled it into welfare state stuff. And that was the decision we made. So this is a generational decision that we made a really, really long time ago, and we've essentially failed to meet up to our commitments ever since then. We weren't the only Western nation to make that decision. We weren't the only Western nation to say, you know what, America's not really going to let us get invaded, so we can basically ride their industrial. Yeah, we had a lot of company there. However, so is 2% of GDP an arbitrary or quote unquote magical target? Well, kinda yes, in the sense that money isn't real, and race is a social construct. Yes, for sure, of course, it's magical and arbitrary, but it's the number we committed to. Like, I don't know what. It's magical because we've all agreed to sit around and decide that was the magical. It's the one we went to our allies and said, we're going to be part of your military alliance and we will commit to this amount of spending. So what the fuck is he talking about? We don't know what that means.
You know,
We know exactly what that means. That's not complicated.
yeah, it's
Now
just
you want to go renegotiate the target. You want to go back to our allies and say, you know what? 1.76 is actually a more realistic target for us. Then fine, go back to our allies and renegotiate the target. But that's what you agreed to. You
in public.
committed to it
No, agreeing,
publicly, repeatedly.
agreeing
Ah.
repeatedly agreeing to do something in public is why they get the collective middle finger and a big fuck you. And to be clear, Bill, not aimed at you personally, you know I like you. But that is a collective fuck you aimed at all of the people who think that they can be misinfo and disinfo warriors and also bullshit. And like the connection doesn't get made in their minds. If someone wants to go out there and make this unrelenting campaign against misinfo and disinfo, hell yeah, great. You can't lie.
Okay,
Like
but
you can't
I don't think this has anything to do with misinfo or disinfo. I think this has to do with our position in the world and the ability for ourselves to take ourselves seriously and for our allies to take us seriously.
Well, are we telling the truth? I mean, what it comes down to, when we repeatedly announce targets we're not going to try and hit, what is that? I choose to call that a lie.
Look, you need to make a case for why we should be spending more on military defense. It's because, look, we're heading into a really fucked up and uncertain timeline where Donald Trump is probably going to be the president. And he's straight up said that if you're not hitting your targets, you're on your own. So I think that a crazy ass Donald Trump could kick us out of NATO? Why not?
Well, no,
why wouldn't
but he could withhold American support for us.
Or he could potentially fuck us over on trade.
Yep.
If we're not meeting our targets. Like, imagine doing UMSCA again, guys, except on this time, we get even worse terms. Or imagine retaliatory trade wars because we're not holding our end of defense. Like, these are the kinds of things we're courting now and have been courting for a really long time. And by the way, if that shit happens, we're going to be in the wrong. Like a lot of the rest of our allies who are increasing their money on their spending on defense aren't going to come to back us because they're going to look around and be like, y'all have been freeloaders for the last 40 goddamn years.
You've been bullshitting us about hitting a 2% target and never trying.
So like I don't know what to tell you. Like you want to be taken seriously by your allies. You want support when things happen in Canada, like the Michaels get kidnapped or when an Indian government engages in a hit job in Canada. You want the kind of international credibility that it goes with. Canada is back. I'm in the middle of a rant, Jamie. Shush. I love you, but give me a minute. You want all of your allies to come behind you when all of a sudden we get into fights with Saudi Arabia, and increasingly you're sort of baffled when our allies are like, fuck you. This shit is why. Yeah. This shit is why. No, 2% isn't a magic number. It's just the one we agreed to. Moving on.
Commitments.
Honor your commitments.
And I would also say, first of all, I have the feeling your son likes to interrupt you just because he knows he's not supposed to. Am I correct?
100%. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Just checking. The thing I would say, what was that exact quote? Magical? You have the
I'll pull it up again.
There. Read it for me again.
Okay, here it is. I'll read it to you again just because it'll get your blood pressure up. Trying to go to cabinet or even to Canadians and tell them that we had to do this because we needed to meet this magical threshold of 2%. ... Don't get me wrong, it's important, but it was really hard to convince people that was a worthy goal, that was some noble standard we had to meet. The noble standard is the commitment you set and need. That's what nobility means.
I'm trying to imagine my wife like confronting me and being like, Matt, I've heard a terrible rumor that you've been banging the cocktail waitress. You've been cheating on me. It's like the latest in your series of affairs. And you gave me wedding vows where you said you should forsake all others. I'm like, what? You know how hard it is for me to take a magical notion seriously, like a vow or a pledge or a commitment? Canada has committed itself and its honor to doing the thing we said in public that we would do. Other countries are doing the thing that we committed ourselves in public to do.
Matt, who's to say you not banging the cocktail waitress was this some sort of noble standard you had to meet? I don't know. Some kind of magical words you said that...
When I said I wouldn't do that kind of thing.
Who even knows what that means, really, Matt? Who even knows what that means?
If let's take the defense minister at 100% face value here. If it's really hard for him to convince his cabinet colleagues that they should do the things we have committed to do, a lot of other things start making sense. You kind of take a step back from the government and go, okay, this is a government that does not feel any particular sense of honor-bound urgency to do the things it has pledged to do. And then you look at the 9 years Justin Trudeau has been prime minister, and then you go, oh, okay. So that explains that.
Matt, just don't even worry about it. Our allies will stand by us, and nobody's going to pick trade fights with us because we're good guys. People know that.
Kidding aside and leaving the cocktail waitresses out of this, one of the really interesting things is that, like, you know me, I'm a weirdo national security guy, and like I talk to other weirdo national security guys. What I'm about to tell you is not off the record per se, but it's not something I'm seeing discussed openly a lot. It does bubble up in the occasional op-ed. There are people who are warning about this, so I'm not going to attribute this to anyone, but I am seeing it pop out in public. It's the notion of a so-called protectorate tax, which is that newly re-inaugurated President Donald Trump looks at Canada and some of the other NATO allies. We're not the only ones who are falling short, and goes, yeah, hey guys, so good news is NATO's still here, not pulling out of NATO, and the great news is you are all still getting U.S. military protection, but your imports to the United States are now being hit with a special tax. A
special military
and we're going to figure out whatever the formula is. And it's not 2% anymore because you guys are delinquent. So now it's 2.5%. I have
been delinquent for like 20 years. Yeah.
So we're gonna maybe add some interest to this, and we're gonna figure out how much you owe the American taxpayer for the failure to meet the pledge that you have made, and we're gonna tax you on your imports and exports coming into the U.S. market. And thanks very much.
And you want to know what?
He would have every right to do that. He'd have every
right.
Yep.
And we'd scream, and you'd have a lot of proggies here in Canada be like, "Oh, those terrible Americans, those terrible Trump, he's the worst ever." And yeah, he is. But guess what? In this case, you're handing it to him. He's right.
There are two issues that Donald Trump has always had a point about, and the problem is he was grabbing so many pussies and doing other insane things that we forget about this stuff. But NATO spending lagging and the U.S. southern border being a disaster are the two issues that centrists and progressives have never wanted to grapple with, that are probably going to get, I mean, especially the border issue. I don't think a lot of Americans are motivated to vote based on NATO ally spending.
No.
But the southern border is just a political disaster that until it is fixed, it is the gift to Mr. Trump that keeps on giving. Laggard NATO allies help him a bit.
Well, I mean, he misrepresents that in the sense that he's treating NATO spending as if we're all putting money into some kind of centralized pot.
Yeah,
no. So he's in the same way that Alberta politicians often misrepresent what equalization means. He's misrepresenting that in that regard. But he's not wrong to note that Canada has consciously chosen, and has been for generations, consciously choosing to underfund and underfund our defense spending and our defense resources, because we made a conscious decision to put our shared collective wealth into what I would call welfare state stuff. And I understand why we made that choice. We did, but we made that choice because we had the luxury of making that choice. That luxury being, we knew very well that America wasn't going to let us get invaded by, Russia. So we made a choice to sort of, to some extent, I think you could make the argument, undermine our own sovereignty and become a relatively defenseless protectorate of the United States militarily, in order to put money into the kind of welfare state spending that most of America doesn't give their own citizens. So Canadians get access to more government wealth in forms of healthcare, schooling, all kinds of things, in part because we're free riding off of America's military industrial complex. Like, that is what we're doing. And that we've been able to get a pass for that for a really long time, because we're the good guys, right? We're back.
Well, because
and we're just starting to find, I think in the last really 10 years, that people are not willing to put up with that shit anymore.
I know this is my thing more than yours or more than most people's, but it's interesting with hindsight to go back, I guess about 8 years. I'd have to look at the calendar when President Obama visited Ottawa. that quick little whirlwind state visit. And in the House of Commons, he gave that speech, and it was a very well-reviewed speech because Canadians loved Barack Obama, and we were all fawning over him, blah, blah, blah. But he very politely called us out, and the phrase he used was, "The world needs more Canada," which warmed Canadian hearts.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, oh, he loves us, he wants more of us. But what he was really saying is, pony the fuck up.
Yeah, we need more of your soldiers.
And he said it in a really polite, Obama-esque way. But then Trump replaces him and comes along and looks around the NATO allies and goes, "Where's the money, chumps?"
Well, the other thing too is I would note is I am old enough to remember when the first out of state trip that an American president would always make would always be to Canada, and it would be like Mexico second. That was the tradition. When did that stop happening? It's now no longer even commented on that. That's no longer a thing that happens. That the American president will often go to Mexico now first. Like they're more closely.
I think it was Obama, but it might have been George W. Bush. I think it was
Obama. Yeah, it could. I think it might have been actually Obama, and it's since then Trump, Biden. It's been the same thing. We've lost that first out of state status. That's a huge. I mean, it's symbolic. It's. I get it, but considering we are America's top trading partner, it's a pretty astonishing snub in a lot of ways, and it's a snub that's ceased to gain any traction or notice here in Canada. I think it's interesting, but I mean, these are the things you lose. You lose international alliances. You're not lose international alliances, but I mean, who's not taking our calls anymore? I mean, there was an interesting story about the fact that Canada got sort of a privileged vaccine access because we're still sort of coasting on a lot of our geopolitical reputation going back to the Second World War, really. And that's going away. The generation that remembers that is dying. So
I don't know. We've never seen the commercial contracts for the COVID vaccine. So who knows how much we actually paid for them.
Who knows? But at the same time, the point I'm just trying to make is, the generation that's now coming into power has no memory of the sacrifices that Canada made in Normandy and Dieppe and all the other places. Like, that's long gone now. We've just been laggards for 40, 50 years now. We're just freeloaders now. And we're not contributing our share, even as the world is getting more and more dangerous. So how is that going to bite us in the ass? That's the question. If I were Bill Blair and I were making this argument to cabinet, I'd be like, what kind of unpredictable ways do you think that is going to bite Canada in the ass in the long run over the next 20 to 30 years? I don't know, but I feel we're going to find out.
A really interesting thing. You and I are both born. I was born in the early 80s. You were born in the mid 80s. Seems like a long time ago now because we're getting older. But the Second World War has always, to me, seemed recent. And I have more of a historical perspective. I think most people do because of what my interests and my educational background are. But growing up, I knew Second World War veterans, and they weren't that old yet. They were still golfing. And I think about it now, and you mentioned the troops at Normandy. 100 years ago, they were born. They were alive already. And within our lifetime, it's already happening. We're going to watch the Second World War become something that was, for us growing up, about as distant as Vietnam was today, to something that's more like the First World War. It's a century ago. It's a different era. Mm-hmm. And most of the capital we've built up is from a different era, from a different century.
Yeah.
And Bill Blair has to explain that to his cabinet colleagues with magic.
Like
I said, Jen, if we take him at his word, it helps to explain things.
It does, doesn't it? Like and subscribe the line. Anyway, sorry about that little rant.
Jen, last segment here. We've been going on for a while. The Foreign Interference Inquiry report is out, and neither of us has read it yet. It landed while we were sitting down to podcast here.
I've skimmed over the intro paragraphs. That's
time zones are on your side a little bit today. What's the top level finding?
Yeah, essentially, this is not any great shock. It's a very interim report. The final one isn't going to be submitted until December of this year. So we'll get into more details later. But essentially, there's nothing here that anybody who's been listening to our podcast will be surprised about. The inquiry found that there's no real evidence to suggest that foreign interference, which has happened in the last two elections, but probably, or almost, sorry, not probably, there's no good evidence to suggest that foreign interference changed the actual outcome of the election, nor did foreign interference extend to preventing votes from being counted or ballots from being cast. Most of the foreign interference we've seen to date has been of a nature that's like, for example, probably the Chinese government spreading misinformation about the Conservative Party in, I believe, Mandarin WeChat kind of group chats, kind of that kind of stuff, non-English group chats. So there have been some issues. However, I think the takeaway line from what we've seen so far is this following quote, which is, quote, "I have not found evidence of any actions taken in bad faith, but I have found that there were some communications problems and a certain lack of understanding of the role that everyone plays or should play in combating foreign interference." And anyone who's been paying attention to what we've been writing for the last 2 years will go, no shit. Yes, one of the major issues that we have seen from the federal government on anything to do with national security or foreign interference has been just a profound lack of communication between minister, prime minister, civil servant, spy, all of these people. There clearly doesn't seem to be a clear pipeline of communication between these parties, which is not to absolve the government in any way. That as you noted in your last column, the lack of good process at this point, the Liberals own that. They've been in power long enough. If there is not a clear process for communicating imminent problems and threats, that's on them. They screwed the pooch. That's absolutely on them. The other one is the lack of clear sort of roles for how people should respond to imminent threats and foreign interference. Again, yes, that has now been established that basically in the face of an imminent problem, 99% of our federal government gets stun fucked and begins to stare off into space like the 1,000-yard stare and go, oh.
Jen, I've told you this story before and it's a quip, but it's like me earlier in my career reporting a serious problem to my manager and my manager listening and being horrified and going, my God, someone needs to do something about this. And then I just sort of sat there looking at him and then it was like, wait a minute. I'm the manager. I have to do something about it. Like, it took my boss a couple of minutes to get that. He was really good at his skill set, but he was a terrible manager. But sometimes in jobs, if you're good at what the job is, you get promoted. People don't often understand that managing a group of bakers does not necessarily require you to be a good baker. And being a great baker doesn't necessarily make you a great manager.
Peter principles apply in all things.
We've got a government, it seems, that seems frustrated, perplexed, and hurt, offended by government not working well. And the idea that part of what is particularly at the PMO and the cabinet level, I don't grab the random MP from any riding out there and be like, how did you let this happen? Like, they're in the legislature side. Now, there's things they can do. They have power and influence, of course, but what we're talking about here, these are executive level failures, and these are executives in the sense both of elected executive officials and the staff appointed to sustain them, which means the prime minister and the cabinet and all their staff. But I also think it means the executive leadership of the civil service. It's like we have a growing compendium of failures within Canadian governance, and it hasn't occurred to the people inside the government yet that it's their job to fix it. Like, no one is more hurt than they are that things that they can control aren't going well. It hurts them more than anyone.
Oh, and I think that you basically
so we will
summed up Canada right there, and it hurts my soul. But anyway, that's fine.
You know that the line you sometimes give your kids, right? Punishing you hurts me more than you. It's like the government of Canada, the executive leadership of at the PMO level, the cabinet level, and the senior civil service level. Seeing government dysfunction hurts them more than us. It breaks their heart. It makes them so sad. And they just wish someone would do something about it and just make the hurting stop. And they're like, hi, voter here.
Well, yeah, and also, yes, that's why Pierre Poilievre is 20 points in the polls. And believe me, when he gets elected, non-zero chance he's going to make a lot of hurting stop. By taking the horse out to the back, shooting it, and leaving it.
It's like I said in my column just a few days ago.
Anyway,
like, The thing that I wish these people would realize was that when I tell them to fix things, it's not just for my personal convenience. Well, hey, okay, sometimes it is, or at least, hey, sometimes I benefit. I like things working well too. But like a lot of the columns I've been writing, particularly on these national security files in recent years, if the PMO, et cetera, fix this stuff, you know who the primary and immediate beneficiary of that would be? PMO, et cetera. But I don't know. It's like my manager. It's like, we got a serious problem here. My God, someone needs to do something about this.
I think that they
Yeah.
basically that they under Trudeau, and I think Trudeau does own this. The size of the civil service has expanded radically. I don't have the numbers to hand, but it's expanded extremely large, to an
Plus
extreme
this
degree.
consultant spending. So there's
Plus
a
the
lot more
consultant
bodies in
spending.
Ottawa doing the
And
work.
by the way, do you feel that you are getting better service from the federal government as a result of that expansion of the workforce? Have you
I've
noticed an
told you this before.
appreciable improvement in internal processes, communications, outcomes at all?
No, and I think
No. In fact, quite the opposite. And in fact, I think there is something called overhiring. This is something that I think
God, yeah.
people who haven't, if you've had this experience where you've gone to, for example, a startup or a new organization that radically overhired, you
Yeah.
start to see really quickly that overhiring for the task at hand creates just as many problems as underhiring for a task at hand.
Because
Too many
so many
bodies in the
people are
room
desperate to justify their existence by generating work that adds no productive value and in fact actually bogs the machine down.
bogs the machine down, or you get a lot of internecine fighting, and so you have a lot of expended time and effort dealing with like interpersonal issues as well. So I've witnessed that firsthand. It's possible to have too many cooks in the kitchen. It's possible to overhire. I think the government is radically overhired, and I think that a lot of the problems that it has to do in the lack of the dispersion of accountability and the dispersion of communication problems, I think actually can be directly tied to overhiring. And then at the same time, while we have had this overhiring, also everything is getting radically centralized through the Prime Minister's office, which only has so much bandwidth. Well, the Prime Minister's office has gotten smaller and smaller, which only has so much bandwidth to deal with compounding problems. And so they're like magpies going from one issue to the next issue to the next issue, and they just get constantly overwhelmed. And because they've lost the ability to actually decentralize out real power, real authority, they can't fix problems, and they're stun fucked. They're stuck in stasis, and they're stuck dealing with the one thing that they all know how to deal with, and that's communications problems
And politics.
So that's what they focus on, right? So they haven't actually divested real power down the chain to the extraordinary number of people they've hired. So there's no clear chains of accountability and communication, while at the same time they're so overwhelmed that they've become narrow, bunker bound, and prone to focus on communications and politics problems as opposed to real reform issues. And you see a couple of like shining lights of exception here. Like, I don't think all of Trudeau's cabinet is bad. I mean, I've praised, for example, like Sean Fraser. I think he's been good on the housing file to date. I just think he's been good on a housing file that is irredeemable. Like he's saying the right things and he's got the right ideas, but nobody has any faith in any of these processes to actually resolve themselves or work themselves out. And the government basically is hired itself into a sclerotic stasis state.
You know what?
Right?
Yeah, I agree with every word of that. Agree, like completely.
Like, I don't know. I'm not on the inside. This is what it looks like from someone from the outside, from the West. This is what it appears to be the problem. But like,
here I am still in the
Laurentian
abode. Like it looks that way from here too.
Yeah, but we're not in it, so we don't know it.
No, but we're not. But look at a series of interviews. Like Paul Wells has been writing about this. Justin Ling, our buddy, had that long interview with the Prime Minister and then built a lot of background into it. The people inside the civil service don't disagree with us. Like that's like they don't say it.
Well, or if they do disagree with us, they're not the sort of people who are reaching out to us.
Oh no! I mean, they're not the sort of people to publicly comment. But to the extent that they are giving interviews and stuff, I don't know if you read the Ling did a podcast with the Prime Minister, but he also wrote that long article about it.
Yeah,
read the article because what I love the most about it, there's a lot of stuff about his talk with the Prime Minister, but he also really goes into like his research on the state of the civil service. And the civil service itself is saying we're not functional anymore.
Yeah.
One of the things kind of that I find interesting about this, and it's something I've warned about many, many times. You and I have talked about this. Over the last few generations, the civil service is basically, a few decades, the civil service has been largely running itself. And because Canadians are conflict and confrontation averse, the civil service has sort of selectively sanded down all the nasty bits, things like accountability and discipline and performance metrics that have teeth. And we've been left with the fact that you see this right across the whole of government, that failures don't actually hurt. It hasn't had an "are we the baddies" moment. Are we the baddies, Jen? As you know, it's from a British comedy sketch where there's two World War II German officers. I don't remember if they were Gestapo or...
Yeah, they're Mitchell and Webb, and they've got skulls all over their hats and things like that.
Well, they're wearing like authentic German uniforms. I don't remember if it was the SS or the Gestapo, but they're looking at each other like, hey, we have skulls on our uniforms. Are we the baddies? And it's this hilarious sketch of like these Germans being like, what if we're the bad guys? No one, it seems like the PM and the people around him have had the "are we the baddies" moment, but not that they're Nazis, but like, are we the problem? Are things that we're doing the problem here? Are the things that we could do to fix it? And look, obviously, you and I, as you note on the outside, we don't have the full perspective of internal deliberations, and we're never going to know their private thoughts.
No.
But if you, in terms of their public commentary, the position of the Liberal government is that what they're doing is good, and if you don't agree that way, you have fallen for conservative disinfo.
Yeah.
And
really, you don't know how good. Yes, we recognize that there are issues with housing and immigration and all these sorts of things, but really, you don't know how good you have it. It would be so much worse if anybody else were in charge. It would be so much worse.
And if that's for public consumption, okay, fair enough. That's why they're down 21 points. What worries me is that that's actually how they feel.
Oh, I think it absolutely is.
So.
No, I have no doubt of that. Anyway, like and subscribe to The Line. That's it. That's it for us this week, guys.
Like and subscribe.
Thanks, subscribe. Thanks for coming to The Line podcast, and I'll see you again next week.
And Edmonton event. Check it out.
Edmonton
we'll put
event.
the link
yes,
in
please.
all of our text. If you're in Edmonton, don't get outplayed by those Calgary people down in Shelbyville, because nobody parties like Springfield. We want to see you guys in Edmonton in June.
Absolutely.
Except Jen, because she's a Calgary person.
All right, but I do want to see the event succeed, so please come.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.